In the name of the Holy and Blessed Trinity, made known to us as the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier of the world. Amen. Please be seated. As we anticipate Lent beginning in a few weeks' time, I feel it's good for me to start my public confessions. So strap yourselves in. I have a number of guilty pleasures. Don't worry, it's none that will make you feel the need to report anything to anyone. But it may, as someone said to me this week, my estimation of you has just gone down a notch. One of my guilty pleasures is I love watching MasterChef. It's all right, fellow MasterChef aficionados, you don't need to confess it to me, we will bond over this. I love watching MasterChef because I love the aspiration that I too could create something as beautiful as what they do on the plate. Instead, I'm just happy if my macaroni cheese turns out. But I love watching the skill and the cleverness, and especially in these last few seasons, the affirmation of the judges in encouraging these chefs to be the best at who they are and what they do. I love their skill in knowing just how much is enough. And I love their skill in knowing in what situations they need to be courageous and use more of a certain spice or herb or flavouring, and in what situations they need to show restraint in order to let the thing shine. But one of the things that comes across constantly is they need to add things in order to let what is sometimes called the hero ingredient shine. They need to season. The judges are always saying, season, taste, season, taste, season, taste. You need to season to bring out the full flavour. And that's what Jesus is talking about in our gospel for today. Salt and light. Use them well, he says. Use them for their intended purposes. Don't hide it away and don't let it go to waste. But use it well. Every time I think particularly of salt, I think of how salt has, in our last couple of decades, turned from something that everyone added to every meal to something which is now viewed as, well, possibly a bit dangerous. We're aware of the effects of too much salt in our diets. I've told you the story before of my paternal grandfather who would pour a pile of salt onto the side of his plate, and every piece of food he took, he would dip in that salt. My father-in-law, despairing of the fact that I had no salt in our house, our marital home, bought me the largest container of salt he could find, because he too added salt to everything. I've come to understand that certain things are improved by salt, but I use it in moderation. But I'm also aware of those times when too much salt can be harmful. I went to the cricket in my recent holiday. After an hour sitting in the sunlight, I was very burnt. Light is useful, But as we know, especially in Australia, too much of a good thing can be harmful. So what does that mean for us in our Christian journey? When Jesus says we are called to be salt and light. We can sometimes interpret the words of Jesus to mean that we are called to have this in abundance and that more is better and that there can never be too much of a good thing. And that's true with things like love and forgiveness and understanding and welcome and the gifts of the Spirit. But salt and light, it's important that we understand that these are gifts which are to be used well, not wasted, but also, like the chefs on MasterChef, used to bring out the flavour, the essence, the colour, used in the right way at the right time, sometimes used courageously and sometimes with restraint. So what do I mean by that? We've all heard the phrase, killing with kindness, and maybe you've experienced that in your life at some point, that friend, that member of the family who is excessively enthusiastic in their care and attention. It can feel smothering or suffocating at times. And I know there's been times in my life when I've been guilty of that. I remember one time many decades ago, before I was ordained, when I was an enthusiastic young woman, we had a new family come to the church I worshipped at. And they came a second week. So obviously I thought that my welcome to them the week before, my hand of friendship, had brought them back, and maybe it had. But that second week, I doubled my efforts at being super friendly and super welcoming and super helpful. And they never came back. Because what I realised afterwards, with shameful reflection, was that actually maybe I'd used a bit too much salt and it had become unpalatable. And that mum had wisely discerned that if I was going to be like that, and if this was the sort of church this was, then she wasn't going to feel comfortable. It was a salient lesson. It was a salty lesson. And that salt still stings in my wound, that I was the cause of someone not returning. It's hard, this gift of discernment, of what is the right measure. And we know it when we're cooking. You know, when we mistake the ingredient list for 1 teaspoon for 1 tablespoon. There's a lot of difference between a teaspoon of salt and a tablespoon of salt, just speaking from personal experience. But this is where we rely on the Spirit to guide us. What am I called to give here, Lord? Is this a moment where I'm called to be courageous? Where I'm called to shine that light? To maybe focus in on something that needs a bit more light shone on it? Is this a time when I'm called to show that light with some restraint? To provide a glow which enables the person to feel safe and comforted and warm, to enable them to come closer to the light, which is your light. We tend to focus in this gospel passage on not using our gifts and what happens when we let them go to waste. And that is good and right and true. That is what Jesus speaks about. But also I think it's helpful for us to remember that sometimes using it in a zealous overabundance, in an extremist way, can also lead to harm. Sometimes we can have too much of a good thing. That is why we need to rely on discernment and our understanding that God will guide us to what is right in a situation. I hope I've learnt from my overzealousness as a young woman. I do desire that everyone comes to know the light of Christ and that everyone in their own way is able to have their fullness released, their flavour, if you like, that distinctiveness about us. But I'm also aware that sometimes I need to show that restraint in order to let the work of God occur. So use our gifts wisely. Discern with God's help what is right and needed in this moment. Do not let them go to waste. Do not use them. But equally, be aware that the other person has gifts to offer too, which they are discerning a way of offering. They too are bearers of salt and light. Allow them the space to enrich our lives in return. Amen.